If you remember the hit game on your iPhone, Flappy Birds, was a phenomenon. Hundreds of millions of people played this game over some period of time. Somebody made it by talking to ChatGPT-4 and Midjourney in an hour. So the perfect example, and listen, it's a game, so it's something silly, but I was talking to two developers this weekend, and one of them was an okay developer, and the other one was an actual 10x developer who's built, very significant companies. And they were coding together last week. And because of how fast ChatGPT and other services were writing code for them, he looked over at her and said, you're basically a 10x developer now. My superpower is gone. So where does this lead you to believe company formation is going to go? Is this going to be, massively deflationary, and companies like Stripe are going to have 100 competitors in a very short period of time? Or are we just going to go down the long tail of ideas and solve everything with software? How is this going to play out in the startup space, David Sachs?
Well, I think it's true that developers, and especially junior developers, get a lot more leverage on their time. And so it is going to be easier for small teams to get to an MVP, which is something they always should have done anyway with their seed round. You shouldn't have needed, 50 developers to build your V1. It should be, that's the founders, really. So that I think is already happening, and that trend will continue. I think we're still a ways away from startups being able to replace entire teams of people. I think right now we're at the phase of this.
Define a ways. Months, years, decades.
Well, it's in the years, I think, for sure. We don't know how many years. And the reason I say that is it's just very hard to replace, 100% of what any of these particular job functions do. 100% of what a sales rep does, 100% of what a marketing rep does, or even what a coder does. So right now, I think we're still at the phase of this where it's a tool that gives a human leverage. And I think we're still a ways away from the, human being completely out of the loop. I think right now, I see it mostly as a force for good, as opposed to something that's creating a ton of dislocation.
Friedberg, your thoughts?
If we follow the trend line, to make that video game that you shared took probably a few hundred human years, then a few dozen human years, then, with other toolkits coming out, maybe a few human months, and now this person did it in one human day using this tooling. So if you think about the implication for that, I mentioned this probably last year, I really do believe that at some point, the whole concept of publishers and publishing maybe goes away. Where, much like we saw so much of the content on the internet today being user-generated, most of the content is made by individuals, posted on YouTube or Twitter. That's most of what we consume nowadays, or Instagram or TikTok in terms of video content. We could see the same in terms of software itself, where you no longer need a software startup or a software company to render or generate a set of tools for a particular user, but that the user may be able to define to their agent, their AI agent, the set of tools that they would individually like to use or to create for them to do something interesting. And so the idea of buying or subscribing to software, or even buying or subscribing to a video game or to a movie or to some other form of content starts to diminish as the leverage goes up with these tools, the accessibility goes up. You no longer need a computer engineering degree or computer science degree to be able to harness them or use them. And individuals may be able to speak in simple and plain English that they would like a book or a movie that looks and feels like the following, or a video game that feels like the following. And so when I open up my iPhone, maybe it's not a screen with dozens of video games, but it's one interface. And the interface says, what do you feel like playing today? And then I can very clearly and succinctly state what I feel like playing, and it can render that game, render the code, render the engine, render the graphics, and everything on the fly for me, and I can use that. And so, I kind of think about this as being a bit of a leveling up, that the idea that all technology, again, starts central and moves to kind of the edge of the network over time, that may be what's going on with computer programming itself now, where the toolkit to actually use computers to generate stuff for us is no longer a toolkit that's harnessed and controlled and utilized by a set of centralized publishers, but it becomes distributed and used at the edge of the network by users like anyone. And then the edge of the network technology can render the software for you. And it really creates a profound change in the entire business landscape of software and the internet. And I think it's it's really like we're just starting to kind of have our heads unravel around this notion, and we're sort of trying to link it to the old paradigm, which is startups are going to get cheaper at smaller teams. But it may be that you don't even need startups for a lot of the stuff anymore. You don't even need teams, and you don't even need companies to generate and render software to do stuff for you anymore.
Chamath, when we look at this, it's kind of a pattern of augmentation, as we've been talking about here. We're augmenting human intelligence, then replacing this replication or this automation, I guess might be a nice way to say it. So it's augmentation, then automation, and then perhaps deprecation. Where do you sit on this? It seems like Sachs feels it's going to take years. Freeberg thinks, hey, maybe startups and content are over. Where do you sit on this augmentation, automation, deprecation journey we're on?
I think that humans have judgment, and I think it's going to take decades for agents to replace good judgment. And I think that's where we have some defensible ground. And I'm going to say something controversial. I don't think developers anymore have good judgment. Developers get to the answer or they don't get to the answer. And that's what agents have done, because the 10x engineer had better judgment than the 1x engineer. But by making everybody a 10x engineer, you're taking judgment away. You're taking code paths that are now obvious and making it available to everybody. It's effectively like what you did in chess. An AI created a solver, so everybody understood the most efficient path in every single spot to do the most EV positive thing, the most expected value positive thing. Coding is very similar that way. You can reduce it and view it very, very reductively. So there is no differentiation in code. And so I think Freeberg is right. So for example, let's say you're going to start a company today. Why do you even care what database you use? Why do you even care which cloud you're built on? To Freeberg's point, why do any of these things matter? They don't matter. They were decisions that used to matter when people had a job to do and you paid them for their judgment. Oh, well, we think GCP is better for this specific workload, and we think that this database architecture is better for that specific workload, and we're going to run this on AWS, but that on Azure. And do you think an agent cares? If you tell an agent, find me the cheapest way to execute this thing, and if it ever gets not, cheaper to go someplace else, do that for me as well, and, ETL all the data and put it in the other thing, and I don't really care.
So you're saying it will swap out Stripe for Adyen or Node for Amazon Web Services. It's going to be ruthless.
It's going to be ruthless. And I think that the point of and that's the exact perfect word, Jason. AI is ruthless because it's emotionless. It was not taken to a steak dinner. It was not brought to a basketball game. It was not sold into a CEO. It's an agent that looked at a bunch of API endpoints, figured out how to write code to it to get done the job at hand that was tasked to it within a budget, right? The other thing that's important is these agents execute within budgets. So another good example was, and this is a much simpler one, but a guy said, I would like 7 days worth of meals. Here are my constraints from a dietary perspective. Here are also my budgetary constraints. And then what this agent did was figured out how to go and use the Instacart plugin at the time, and then these other things, and execute within the budget. How is that different when you're a person that raises $500,000 and says, I need a full stack solution that does X, Y, and Z for $200,000? It's the exact same problem. So I think it's just a matter of time until we start to cannibalize these extremely expensive, ossified large organizations that have relied on a very complicated go-to-market and sales and marketing motion. I don't think you need it anymore in a world of agents and auto GPTs. And I think that to me is quite interesting because A, it creates an obvious set of public company shorts. And then B, you actually want to arm the rebels. And arming the rebels, to use the Toby Lutke analogy here, would mean to seed hundreds of one-person teams, hundreds, and just say, go and build this entire stack all over again using a bunch of agents.
Yeah,
and I think recursively, you'll get to that answer in less than a year.